it's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry that I couldn't join the conference live, but my travel schedule and my time difference doesn't permit it. This is the subject you've asked me to address today, the Ukraine war, which I think is as important a topic as any of us in the anti-imperialist movement and the left, and whatever your political persuasion may be, as a matter of fact, could be talking about today. This is an existentially dangerous war. We have, in effect, Russia on the one side with more nuclear weapons than any country on earth. And on the other side, not simply Ukraine. Ukraine is simply the front line of this war, but the entirety of NATO really engaged in a hot battlefield, generating levels of destruction and violence that we haven't seen since the Second World War, arguably. And we should have no illusions about this. NATO and Russia are at war. Sadly, tragically, and really appallingly, the Ukrainian people are being used by NATO to conduct a proxy war because, frankly, if we were sending our own soldiers en masse to engage in this extraordinarily violent and destructive war against a peer enemy, there would be a rebellion in the West. We wouldn't have any stomach, and rightly so, for the cataclysmic losses that NATO forces would be sustaining if it weren't for the Ukrainians who are sacrificing their lives to sustain the war, doing so. And that's what this is all about. This is, to put it bluntly and crudely, but aptly, this is the NATO using the Ukrainian people as cannon fodder. There's so much that can be said about how we got here, but the story, I think, certainly begins around the time of the demise of the Soviet Union. In order to induce the government of the Soviet Union at the time, led by Mikhail Gorbachev, not to oppose the reunification of Germany, Western governments, not simply the US government, Western governments repeatedly assured Mr. Gorbachev that NATO would not expand eastward. And that promise has been broken repeatedly. It's said in the mainstream discourse that this is simply a pretext for Russia's acquisitive, invasion of Ukraine. But in fact, William Burns, the current director of the CIA, when he was posted in a diplomatic capacity in Russia some years ago, he delivered a cable back to the State Department, which was later leaked by WikiLeaks, in which he said he had spoken to people in the Russian political elite across the political spectrum, and from liberals, pro-Western liberals, right up to the persons whom he regarded as nationalist knuckle draggers. And he said universally they were strongly opposed to the admission of Ukraine to NATO. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out why. All you have to do is look at a map. All you have to do is look at the proximity of Ukraine to Moscow, look at the coastline that Ukraine has in the Black Sea, which is of strategic importance to Russia because it provides a warm water port at Sebastopol, access to the Mediterranean. These historical ties between Ukraine and Russia, the fact that there are millions of ethnic Russians and Russian speakers in Ukraine to this very day. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand why the Russian political elite across the political spectrum was deeply concerned about this. And that promise was broken. It was broken repeatedly. And rather than react initially, the Russian government tried for some 12, 14 years, going all the way back to the Munich Security Conference of 2000, 2007, 2008, to persuade the NATO powers not to take this additional provocative step. And they did so nonetheless, or at least made it very clear that it was in their intention to do so. And by the time you get to the invasion, Ukraine had become de facto a member of NATO, not de jure, but de facto. It was heavily armed with NATO weaponry, and many of its units were trained to NATO standards. It was conducting military exercises in a provocative manner with NATO forces. So that really is the overarching reason. But of course, there are others. There was a coup in Ukraine in 2014. The head of Stratfor at the time called it the most blatant coup in history, orchestrated by the United States to place in power a Ukrainian nationalist government that immediately began to implement policies that were hostile to the ethnically Russian population and Russian-speaking population of Ukraine. And, you know, there was talk about over the intervening years after a civil war broke out, and thousands of civilians in the Donbass were killed, primarily on the pro-Russian side. There was talk at the highest levels of the Ukrainian government developing a nuclear arsenal. There were a whole series of provocations. And so we now have on our hands an existentially dangerous war in which our side, and I say our loosely, by that I mean, of course, the Western side, are engaging in ever more provocative actions and escalating the conflict. And this can only end in one way if we continue down this path. The best case scenario is the complete and utter destruction. And I say that obviously not wanting it to happen. My passionate desire is that it doesn't happen. But the least awful outcome, if we remain on the path where we currently find ourselves, is the total destruction of Ukraine. The worst possible outcome is the total destruction of humanity in a nuclear exchange, a full-scale nuclear exchange. So it behooves us to do everything we can to tell the truth about why this war is happening. It has nothing to do with democracy, human rights, and international law, which is the mantra that NATO has adopted. And how do we know this? Well, when has NATO ever acted, and particularly the United States government that is driving the NATO bus, when in the post-World War II period has it ever engaged in warfare, either directly or through a proxy for noble reasons? The United States has enjoyed, since the demise of the Soviet Union, a position of unparalleled dominance. It has been a unipolar world that we have lived in since that point in time, and it sees that with the rise of China, and to a lesser degree the rise or the return of Russia as a great power, that its position of global hegemony is now in jeopardy, and it is hell-bent to put an end to that. And we should have no illusions about where this will end. In the extremely unlikely outcome that NATO actually defeats Russia on its own border, what will then happen? What will then happen is that NATO will focus its attention on China and will attempt, and has in fact begun to attempt, to employ the same strategy with respect to Taiwan, and use Taiwan as a Western bulwark off the coast of China in order to weaken, contain, and provoke China into a devastating war. That's where this will head next. So if we survive the nuclear exchange, or the risk of nuclear war in the Ukraine war, we're going to be confronted probably by an even greater risk of nuclear war in the South China Sea. And in order to achieve its nefarious hegemonic agenda, all the levers of the propaganda system of the West are being brought to bear. These truths are being suffocated. People who speak about them are either being ignored or marginalized. In my own case, you know, prior to the time that I began to speak out about the Ukraine war, which is almost immediately upon the commencement of the Russian invasion in February of last year, I have been virtually blackballed by the mainstream media. Prior to that time, despite my anti-imperialist views and despite my my socialist leanings, I had probably been quoted more in the mainstream media in Canada than any other practicing lawyer. Most of it had to do with my legal practice, but a good bit of it had to do with my views about geopolitics and my running for political office for the leadership of the Green Party of Canada in 2020. Since then, I have not, even though it's well known to the mainstream media and to Canada's political class, that I am fiercely opposed to NATO's participation in this war. And my position is that we should provide strictly humanitarian aid to the Ukrainian people and do everything we can to achieve a diplomatic resolution. It's well known to them that that's my position. I've had 2 interactions with the mainstream media on this issue since the invasion began. The first one was the Journal de Montréal did a hit piece on me and Yves Engler with the assistance of a pro-NATO academic at the University of Calgary, in which they insinuated that Mr. Engler and I, and Yves, to his great credit, has been also quite outspoken about condemning the NATO proxy war. They insinuated that we are doing this for some kind of financial gain, you know, with absolutely not a shred of evidence to support it. And there is absolutely no truth to it. I have not been paid a single penny by anyone to advocate for a peaceful resolution to this war. I haven't been paid a single penny to write about this subject. I haven't been paid a single penny to appear on RT as I have Russia Today on several occasions, to talk about my opposition to this war. There's just simply no truth to it. That was my one interaction. And the other interaction was that a gentleman who, I'm, out of respect for him, a member of the mainstream media, I'm not going to mention his name. He interviewed me for an hour, recorded the conversation, and asked entirely fair questions, and even admitted at the outset, he confided in me, and this is why I'm not going to tell you his name, that he understood completely why I have profound skepticism towards the mainstream media in this country. He did a report. The report was balanced, but a full 10 seconds of my commentary ended up in the actual report. Almost everything that I said was edited out of the final product. And I have a strong suspicion that that wasn't a decision that he made. I have a decision, my suspicion is that based on our conversation, that was a decision that was made by the editorial staff of the media organization in question. And so, I've seen others. Of course, this is just my own experience. There are academics who've been silenced and smeared. People like Ivan Kachanovsky, a Ukrainian, a professor of Ukrainian origin at the University of Ottawa. Paul Robinson, who actually, I think, also at the University of Ottawa, with a great deal of expertise in military matters and in the Soviet Union and Russia, he actually was afforded an opportunity, surprisingly, to speak in a parliamentary hearing, but he was treated with hostility. He, was never invited back. Since then, he's been largely ignored. On the other hand, you have people, who are pro-NATO, pro-Ukraine war, pro the arming of this coup regime in Ukraine, who are being given ample space to speak about this war in the Canadian media. And so the obvious reality is that if we're going to get the truth out to the Canadian public, which is absolutely indispensable given the extraordinary stakes involved in this conflict, we need desperately to support the independent media in Canada. They're the only ones out there who are willing to treat this subject fairly and in the detail and with the integrity that it so desperately deserves. And that's why, organizations like this one deserve our support. I'll be meeting with academics in Moscow. I'll be meeting with, I would hope, and I'm currently in discussions about this, government officials. I want to meet with ordinary people in Russia and get their views on what's happening and listen to them with an open mind, and then hopefully be in a position to convey whatever wisdom or understanding I acquire from those interactions with my fellow Canadians and other people in the West. And again, being able to convey whatever I might learn, I'm going to have to do that through the independent media. Thank God for its existence, because otherwise it would be very difficult to share those important experiences with my fellow citizens in the West. So thank you for the opportunity given to me to speak today, and I wish you all well, and look forward to interacting with you in the future.